3 weeks before her younger brother Daniel's wedding, Margaret was sitting on the porch of her small home in Jacksonville, North Carolina. The quiet afternoon breeze moved gently through the tall pine trees, and in front of her lay a thick stack of paperwork for her retirement after more than 30 years of service in the United States Marine Corps. Her life was about to enter a new chapter, and she was trying to finish the final tasks of her military career. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. The caller ID showed one name, Mom. Margaret smiled softly and answered right away. At her mother's age, every call felt precious. They chatted for a few minutes about ordinary things, her mother's health, the backyard garden, and Daniel's upcoming wedding. At first, the conversation felt warm and familiar. Then, her mother's voice slowed, as if she were hesitating. "Margaret, I want to talk to you about Daniel's wedding." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. 32 years in the military had taught her how to recognize the moment someone was about to say something difficult. Finally, her mother said it. Daniel didn't want her to wear her military uniform to the wedding. For a few seconds, Margaret wondered if she had heard wrong. Her uniform wasn't just clothing. It represented her entire life, the brutal years of training, the deployments far from home, and the fellow Marines who had stood beside her through war, loss, and sacrifice. Her mother explained that Daniel and his fiancée were planning an elegant ceremony at a vineyard, with many friends from the city attending. They were worried that Margaret's uniform might stand out too much and make some of the guests uncomfortable. Margaret sat there in silence for a long moment. 32 years of serving her country. From a young officer to eventually becoming a brigadier general, she had commanded hundreds of Marines and faced countless dangerous missions. Yet to her own family, all of that still seemed like something distant and unfamiliar. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm. "Mom," she said gently, "my uniform is part of who I am." On the other end of the line, her mother didn't answer right away. The silence lasted a few seconds, long enough for Margaret to realize that her family had never truly seen the path she had walked for more than 3 decades. Margaret had grown up in a small town near Dayton, Ohio, in the 1970s. It was a place where people believed life should follow a very clear path. Boys would grow up to work and build careers, while girls would learn to cook, get married, and raise families. The Carter family was no different from the others in town. Her father owned a small hardware store on Main Street, and her mother taught Bible class at church every weekend. In the family, Daniel, Margaret's younger brother, was always the pride and joy. He was good at baseball, friendly with everyone, and fit perfectly into the image people expected. Their parents often said Daniel would one day take over their father's store. Margaret, however, was different. From a young age, she loved climbing trees, taking apart lawnmowers, and spending hours in the garage fixing cars with her father. At just 12 years old, Margaret could change the oil in a pickup truck faster than many grown men in town. It both surprised and puzzled her father. One afternoon, when he saw her taking apart a carburetor in the garage, he stood in the doorway and said half-jokingly, "You know, most girls your age are learning how to cook." Margaret simply wiped her hands on a rag and replied calmly, "Maybe that's because they don't have a carburetor that needs fixing." Her father smiled, but people still thought of her as an unusual girl. When Margaret was 17, she told her family that she was thinking about joining the Marine Corps. The dinner table fell silent immediately. Daniel laughed, assuming she was joking. Her mother looked worried, and her father set down his fork and asked why she would want to do something like that. "Because I want to serve," Margaret answered. But in her family's eyes, the military was not a path for a daughter. They didn't forbid her from going, but they didn't encourage her either. 2 years later, when Margaret left home to attend officer training, her mother cried at the airport, her father quietly shook her hand, and Daniel joked that she would be back within a week. No one said they were proud of her. And in the years that followed, even as Margaret continued to rise through the ranks, that silence never truly changed. When Margaret left the small town in Ohio to attend Marine Corps officer training, she knew the road ahead would not be easy. The first days at the training base in Quantico, Virginia, proved that more clearly than anything she had imagined. Long runs through thick mud, brutal obstacle courses, and training sessions that stretched from early morning until late at night pushed many candidates to their limits, and some simply gave up. For Margaret, the challenge was even greater. At that time, women in the Marine Corps were still very few, and not everyone believed they truly belonged there. On the very first day, one instructor stopped in front of her and said bluntly, "You're going to have to be twice as good as everyone else here, because half of them already think you shouldn't be here." Margaret didn't argue. She simply worked harder. She ran longer, trained more intensely, and studied late into the night. For her, quitting had never been an option. After graduating and becoming a young officer, Margaret began a life of constant movement. She served at various bases from California to Okinawa and later to North Carolina. Some years, she spent months away from home on overseas deployments. In those tense and dangerous environments, she learned how to make quick decisions and lead the Marines under her command. Over time, her dedication and ability gradually earned recognition. Margaret was promoted from captain to major, then to lieutenant colonel, and later to colonel. Each time, she called home to share the news with her family. But the reaction from back home was always much the same, a few brief congratulations before the conversation quickly drifted to everyday matters. Still, Margaret kept moving forward. More than 30 years passed. She had led hundreds of Marines through different missions and became a leader deeply respected by those who served under her. Finally, during a formal ceremony attended by senior officers, 2 silver stars were pinned onto her shoulders. Margaret Carter had officially become a brigadier general in the United States Marine Corps, an extraordinary achievement, especially for a girl who had grown up in a small town where no one had ever imagined that one day they would have a general among them. On the morning of Daniel's wedding, Margaret woke up in a small hotel near Charlottesville, Virginia. Early sunlight streamed through the window, lighting up the quiet room. It should have been a happy morning. Her younger brother was getting married, the family would be together, and everyone would celebrate an important day. But inside Margaret, there was still a faint tension, like a small knot that had never quite been untied. After getting ready, she opened the closet. Inside hung the garment bag that held her Marine Corps uniform, carefully pressed ahead of time. Margaret stood still for a few seconds before slowly pulling the zipper down. The dark blue dress blues appeared in the morning light, with rows of polished medals and 2 silver stars on the shoulders. For a Marine, a uniform is not just clothing. It represents years of service, the missions endured, and the comrades who stood beside you along the way. Margaret gently smoothed the fabric on the sleeve, took a deep breath, and allowed herself a small smile. She decided she would wear it. About 20 minutes of driving brought her to the vineyard where the wedding was being held. The setting was beautiful. Rows of grapevines stretching across the hills, tables covered with white cloths, and guests dressed elegantly while chatting before the ceremony began. When Margaret stepped out of her car and walked toward the venue, her uniform immediately drew attention. At first, it was only a few curious glances, but as she entered the hall, more people began turning to look. A Marine Corps uniform always stands out, especially when it carries the 2 silver stars of a general. Margaret walked calmly across the room, maintaining the composed presence she had developed as an officer. However, on the other side of the hall, her mother had already spotted her. She quickly walked over, her voice quiet but filled with worry. "Margaret, you're really wearing it?" Margaret simply nodded. Before she could say anything else, Daniel had already walked over. The moment he saw his sister in her uniform, his expression immediately changed. His surprise quickly turned into irritation. "Maggie," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "you actually wore your uniform here." Margaret looked straight at her brother. "Yes." Daniel glanced around the room. A few guests were still looking in their direction, whispering quietly to each other. He lowered his voice, clearly uncomfortable. "This is Emily's wedding. You're drawing too much attention." Margaret didn't react strongly. She simply stood there, calm and composed the same way she had stood in countless difficult situations throughout her years in the military. While Daniel was still visibly annoyed, neither of them knew that in just a few moments, something unexpected would happen, something that would completely change the atmosphere of the wedding. Margaret was still standing in the reception hall when Daniel finished speaking. The air between the 2 siblings grew tense. Around them, nearby conversations began to slow as more guests curiously glanced toward her striking uniform. Then, suddenly, a sharp sound broke the quiet from the far end of the room. A chair scraped loudly as it was pushed back from the table. A man in a suit stood up abruptly. Margaret recognized it instantly. He was a Marine. Even though he wasn't wearing a uniform, the straight posture and serious expression gave him away. Within seconds, another man stood up as well. Then another person stood. And then another. In the blink of an eye, across the tables in the hall, men and women who had once served in the United States Marine Corps rose to their feet. Some were guests from the bride's side of the family, some were friends, and some were simply people who happened to be there. But all of them recognized the same thing, the uniform and the rank on Margaret's shoulders. Chairs scraped loudly across the wooden floor, the sound echoing through the entire room. Then a voice rang out, strong and clear. "General on deck." Immediately, 20 Marines snapped to attention. In one perfectly synchronized motion, they raised their hands in a formal military salute. The entire hall seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The music from the string quartet fell silent. All 120 wedding guests turned to look at Margaret. The moment lasted less than 10 seconds. But it was enough to change everything. Margaret stood tall, her officer's cap tucked under her arm. With the calm composure of a seasoned leader, she gently returned their salute. Then she spoke briefly, her voice steady and composed. "Carry on." 20 arms lowered at the same time, and the Marines slowly sat back down. But the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Across the hall, Daniel stood frozen. His face had turned pale, as if he had just realized something he had never truly understood before. Margaret's mother stood still, unable to say a word. And her father. He had just dropped the glass of wine in his hand. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed only on the 2 silver stars on his daughter's shoulders. In that moment, for the first time in more than 30 years, Margaret's family began to see who she really was. After Margaret returned the salute and said, "Carry on," the 20 Marines slowly lowered their hands and sat back down. But the atmosphere in the hall was completely different now. The whispers that had filled the room earlier no longer carried curiosity or discomfort. Instead, there was a clear sense of respect. A few minutes later, as conversations slowly resumed, the first person to approach Margaret's table was an older man with silver hair and a slightly stiff walk. He stopped in front of her, nodded politely, and said in a warm, steady voice, "I served in Vietnam, with the 1st Cavalry Division." Margaret immediately stood up and shook his hand. Among people who had served in the military, respect comes naturally. They spoke for a few minutes about their years in service, and before leaving, the man smiled with clear admiration. "Looks like you've done some remarkable things." After that, people began approaching Margaret's table, one by one. Another man introduced himself as a former Air Force pilot. An elderly woman said her husband had fought in Korea. A young man shared that his younger brother had just joined the Marine Corps. Each conversation was brief, but filled with respect. On the other side of the hall, Daniel continued watching everything unfold. At first, his expression still carried a trace of irritation. But as more and more people approached Margaret to greet her with clear respect, his expression slowly began to change. The annoyance faded, replaced first by confusion and then by quiet reflection. Beside him, Margaret's mother was also watching her daughter. Silently, she studied the uniform, the rows of medals shining under the lights, and the way people spoke to Margaret as if she were a true leader. Their father said almost nothing. He simply stood in the corner of the room, occasionally glancing toward Margaret with a thoughtful expression, as though he were trying to piece together a story he had never truly listened to before. For many years, their family had always thought of Margaret as simply the daughter who works in the military. But that evening, in the middle of a peaceful wedding in the Virginia countryside, they began to realize that her life was far bigger than they had ever imagined. After the ceremony ended and the guests began moving outside to the garden for the evening reception, the atmosphere grew lighter. Warm yellow lights were strung along the vineyard rows, soft jazz music drifted through the air, and people returned to their familiar conversations. Margaret stood alone near a wooden railing, looking out over the rolling hills. After a long day, she just wanted a few quiet minutes. Just then, she heard slow footsteps approaching from behind. When Margaret turned around, she saw her father walking toward her. He stopped a few steps away, his hands in the pockets of his suit jacket. There was an awkwardness in his eyes, something Margaret had rarely seen in him before. The two of them stood in silence for a few seconds. Finally, he spoke first. I wanted to talk to you for a moment. Margaret gave a small nod. Of course. Her father rested his hands on the wooden railing and looked out over the rows of grapevines. It seemed as though he was trying to organize his thoughts. For many years, he said slowly, I always believed the military had taken my daughter away. Margaret didn't respond. She simply listened. He continued, his voice quieter now. You left home very young. After that came the deployments, the places I had never even heard of, and long stretches of time when we didn't see you. He let out a slow breath. I thought, the military had changed you, made you distant. Margaret looked at him, but still remained silent. After a few seconds, he turned toward her. But today, when those Marines stood up and saluted you, he paused for a moment, as if replaying the scene in his mind. I looked into their eyes. It wasn't just respect, it was trust. He shook his head slightly, almost surprised by his own realization. Those people would follow you anywhere, and that's when I understood. The military didn't take my daughter away. He looked directly at Margaret. It turned you into a leader. Silence filled the air again, but this time it wasn't tense. Finally, her father said something Margaret had never heard from him in all her years of service. His voice was slow, but certain. I'm proud of you. Margaret didn't respond right away. She simply nodded slightly, and in that moment, the distance that had existed between them for so many years seemed to shrink. After the conversation with her father, Margaret walked back toward the wedding reception. The atmosphere was completely different from when she had first entered the hall hours earlier. People were laughing and talking, glasses of wine were being raised in celebration, and soft music played under the warm yellow lights strung along the vineyard rows. There was no dramatic argument, no emotional apology, but Margaret could clearly feel that something in her family had changed. When she approached the family table, her mother was the first to look up. The tension that had been in her eyes earlier was gone. She looked at Margaret's uniform for a moment longer, then gave a small smile. You look very dignified, she said softly. It wasn't a big compliment, but for Margaret, it was enough to know that her mother was beginning to see things differently. A little later, at first he looked slightly awkward, as if he were trying to figure out how to begin a conversation he had never expected to have. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, Maggie. Margaret turned to face her brother. Daniel looked at her uniform for a few seconds before continuing. I think I might have misunderstood a few things. Margaret didn't interrupt. She simply waited for him to continue. Daniel let out a quiet breath. When I saw everyone stand up and salute you earlier, that's when I realized what you've actually accomplished. He gave a small, embarrassed smile. Looks like you're a lot more important than I thought. Margaret let out a soft laugh. It was the first time that day she felt the tension truly lift. Just then, the wedding photographer began calling everyone together for a family photo. Daniel glanced over in that direction, then suddenly looked back at Margaret. You're still wearing the uniform, right? Yes. Daniel nodded. Then, stand next to me in the wedding photo. Margaret looked slightly surprised. Are you sure? Aren't you worried I'll draw too much attention anymore? Daniel laughed. If anyone's going to draw attention in my wedding photo, I think you're the right person for the job. A few minutes later, when the whole family gathered in front of the camera, Margaret stood beside her brother in her Marine Corps dress blues. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel like an outsider in her own family anymore. A few years after Daniel's wedding, Margaret's life gradually entered a new stage. After 33 years of service in the Marine Corps, she officially retired. The decision was not an easy one, because the military had been such a large part of her life. But Margaret understood that it was time to make room for the next generation of officers. On the day she left the base for the last time as an active duty officer, she stood looking across the familiar parade ground where she had spent so many years training, leading, and watching young Marines grow into confident soldiers. The feeling was both proud and peaceful. Even though she no longer wore her uniform every day, Margaret didn't completely step away from the military. She began mentoring younger officers, especially women who were just beginning their journey into leadership roles. Many of them sought her advice about handling pressure and proving themselves in a demanding environment. Margaret also started visiting high schools and universities